Before I tell you what this plant is, ask yourself, why would governments spend millions creating herbicides to destroy a food that sustained entire civilizations for 6,000 years? Why would they classify something more nutritious than most crops as one of the worst weeds on Earth? If this sounds insane, it's because it is. Subscribe now because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see everything growing in your backyard. There's a food so powerful that ancient pharaohs demanded it for their journey into the afterlife. A tuber so nutritious it kept civilizations alive through droughts, famines, and wars. It produces more calories per acre than wheat. It survives conditions that kill corn. It requires no fertilizer, no pesticides, no expensive machinery. And today, agricultural departments have declared war on it. They've engineered chemicals specifically to poison it out of existence. They've published technical bulletins calling it a menace. They've created an entire industry dedicated to its eradication, making millions by teaching farmers to destroy what once fed empires. This is the story of the superfood they rebranded as a weed. And once you understand why, you'll never trust the food industry again. The discovery that changed everything. In the early 1900s, archaeologists excavating pre-dynastic Egyptian tombs made a discovery that rewrote human nutritional history. Inside burial chambers dating back 6,000 years, they found something unexpected. Not treasures of gold or jewels, but dried tubers carefully preserved and placed alongside the deceased. These weren't random food offerings tossed in as an afterthought. Analysis revealed they had been deliberately selected, processed, and prepared with ritual significance. Studies of mummies found these same tubers inside their stomachs. The dead had consumed them as their final meal before entering eternity. The living placed them in tombs, believing these tubers would sustain souls in the afterlife. But the evidence goes back even further. At Wadi Kubaniya, north of Aswan, archaeologists uncovered wild roots of this plant dating to 16,000 BCE. Read that again. 16,000 years ago. That's 8,000 years before agriculture as we know it even existed. These were wild harvests, proving humans were gathering this food during the last ice age when survival meant knowing which plants kept you alive. By 5000 BCE, this plant had become one of the most ancient cultivated foods in all of Egypt, ranking only behind emmer wheat and barley. It wasn't supplemental. It wasn't a side dish. It was foundational to the entire civilization that built the pyramids. In the tomb of Rekhmir, vizier to Pharaoh Thutmose III, wall paintings show the importance of this food. You can see peasants measuring and preparing these tubers, workers grinding them with long pestles, mixing them with honey, shaping the mixture into tall, pointed cones. These were sacred cakes, offerings to the god Amun, instituted by royal decree for every feast. The ancient Egyptians called them Habal Aziz. The Greeks knew them. Theophrastus wrote about boiling them in beer. The Romans traded them across their empire. For thousands of years, they were everywhere, feeding everyone from slaves to pharaohs. This is chufa, scientifically known as Cyperus esculentus. The Spanish call it chufa. Africans call it aya, or tiger nuts. In English, they're marketed as tiger nuts because of their striped skin. But here's the critical detail. They're not nuts at all. They're tubers, underground energy storage organs that represent 16,000 years of human survival technology. What makes this plant extraordinary chufa is a member of the sedge family, the same family that gave us papyrus, the writing material that preserved human knowledge for millennia. It grows in marshes, in wet soils, in conditions where most food crops would simply rot and die. The plant has distinctive triangular stems and develops an underground network of tubers that can number 75 per plant. The tubers themselves are small, roughly the size of a chickpea. They taste sweet and nutty, somewhere between almonds and coconut with an earthy undertone. Ancient Egyptians ate them raw, roasted over open fires, boiled in beer, or ground with honey into ceremonial cakes. They also used chufa medically. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, prescribes chufa mixtures for everything from mouth treatments to fumigations designed to sweeten the smell of houses and temples. Beyond Egypt, Arabs carried chufa to North Africa, Sicily, and eventually Spain. In Valencia, it became the foundation of horchata de chufa, a cold, sweet, milk-like beverage that has been produced there since the 13th century. Today, Valencia still cultivates over 1,000 tons annually specifically for horchata production, protecting it as cultural heritage. But here's what separates chufa from almost every other food. It wasn't just nutrition. It was survival technology engineered by nature itself. The tubers can be dried and stored indefinitely without refrigeration, without chemicals, without any preservation method whatsoever other than air. Once dried, they keep for years, even decades. When you need them, you simply soak them in water for a few hours. They swell back to full size, ready to eat or to plant. That storage capacity meant ancient peoples could harvest chufa in November, dry it through winter, and have guaranteed food security through drought, famine, war, and siege. In a world without refrigeration, without canning, without modern preservation, chufa represented the difference between survival and starvation. The nutritional profile. They don't want you to know. Now let's talk about what's inside these tubers, because this is where the suppression becomes absolutely criminal. Chufa contains up to 10% protein, comparable to many grains. But unlike most plant proteins, chufa contains all essential amino acids, making it a complete protein source. The fat content is high, reaching 25 to 30%, but it's mostly healthy unsaturated fats like oleic acid, the same beneficial fat found in olive oil that everyone pays premium prices for. Researchers have even proposed chufa as a biodiesel crop because the oil yield is so extraordinarily high. The carbohydrate content is primarily resistant starch. This is crucial. Resistant starch feeds beneficial gut bacteria and doesn't spike blood sugar the way regular starch does. Chufa has twice the starch content of potatoes, but with a significantly lower glycemic impact. You get sustained energy without the blood sugar crash that leaves you hungry an hour later. The fiber content is nearly 4 times higher than standard fiber sources, promoting gut health in ways the Egyptians understood intuitively 3,000 years before we had microscopes to see bacteria. It's also rich in minerals, calcium for bones, magnesium for muscles and nerves, iron for blood, and potassium for heart function. It's naturally gluten-free, dairy-free, and allergen-friendly. You can grind chufa into flour for baking, you can blend it into milk, you can roast it for snacks, you can eat it raw. It's one of the most versatile, nutritionally complete, and environmentally sustainable foods on the planet. So here's the question nobody in the agricultural industry wants to answer. If this tuber is nutritionally superior to most cultivated crops, if it has been sustaining civilizations for 16,000 years, if it requires no fertilizer and survives drought conditions that kill everything else, why is it not a staple food? Why do we plant wheat, corn, and soybeans that require constant chemical inputs instead? The answer is simple, brutal, and reveals everything about who actually controls what we eat. The moment. Everything changed. Chufa cannot be controlled, and the moment it escaped from Spain into commercial agriculture, they declared total war on it. They branded it a weed. They mobilized every weapon industrial agriculture had to eradicate it from existence. They rewrote the narrative from superfood of pharaohs to agricultural menace. Yellow nutsedge, the wild form of chufa, is now officially classified as one of the world's worst agricultural weeds. Not a minor problem, not an inconvenience. one of the absolute worst threats to modern farming. Agricultural extension offices publish bulletins about it. Universities conduct extensive research on killing it. Chemical companies engineer herbicides specifically formulated to destroy it. The United States Department of Agriculture published Technical Bulletin number 1642 specifically about yellow nutsedge, calling it a menace in the Corn Belt. Read that again. The USDA dedicated federal resources, taxpayer money, to studying how to kill a plant that fed pharaohs for 6,000 years. Why? Why this level of institutional hostility towards something so clearly valuable? Because yellow nutsedge spreads via underground tubers that regenerate even after the visible plant is killed. One plant can produce 75 tubers. Each tuber can survive in soil for years, lying dormant through winter, through drought, waiting for conditions to improve. It's nearly impossible to eradicate once established. Herbicides kill the leaves, but the tubers survive underground, ready to sprout again. That regenerative capacity, that resilience, that absolute refusal to die, that's exactly what made it valuable for 6,000 years. Its survival perfected by millions of years of evolution. But for industrial agriculture, which demands monocultures of patented seeds that must be purchased annually, which requires farmers to be dependent on chemical inputs year after year, CHUFA represents an existential nightmare. The arsenal of destruction. So they created an arsenal of chemicals specifically engineered to kill it. Glyphosate, halosulfuron, sulfentrazone, bentazone, an entire pharmacopoeia of poisons designed specifically to stop CHUFA from growing. The chemical companies made millions developing, patenting, and selling these herbicides. Research papers document the struggle in clinical language that barely conceals the frustration. They admit that single applications often fail. They recommend sequential treatments, spraying multiple times per season year after year, just to achieve 90% control. Not eradication, just control. The plant keeps coming back. That's the real threat. Not that CHUFA competes with crops for nutrients or water, but that CHUFA reveals how fragile, how artificially dependent, how fundamentally unsustainable industrial agriculture actually is. Our commodity crops require perfect conditions. They need constant inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. They need chemical protection from every threat. They need massive infrastructure, tractors, combines, irrigation systems, grain elevators, processing facilities. They need an entire industrial system just to survive, let alone produce food. CHUFA requires none of that. It just grows. It produces food abundantly, year after year, without asking permission, without requiring inputs, without generating profits for chemical companies. In Spain, where CHUFA is still cultivated as a food crop, yields range from 3 to 6 tons per acre. Compare that to wheat, which averages 3 tons per acre with intense chemical management, perfect soil, precise irrigation, and favorable weather. Even on poor soils, wild CHUFA yields hundreds of pounds of nutrient-dense food with zero inputs. And because the tubers store indefinitely, there's no waste, no spoilage, no need for refrigeration or preservation. Harvest, dry, store. Food security for years. The economic threat they cannot tolerate. But here's what industrial agriculture absolutely cannot tolerate. You cannot patent CHUFA. It's been cultivated for 6,000 years. It's in the public domain. It belongs to humanity, not to corporations. You cannot sell herbicides for a crop that naturally outcompetes weeds. You cannot sell fertilizer for a crop that thrives in poor soil. You cannot sell expensive equipment for a harvest that's traditionally done by hand. You cannot create dependency when farmers can save their own tubers and replant them indefinitely without ever purchasing new seed. The entire economic model of industrial agriculture requires crops that need constant inputs, crops that generate recurring revenue, crops that keep farmers dependent on corporate supply chains. Chufa represents everything that model opposes. It's free, it's resilient, it perpetuates itself naturally, and therefore it had to be classified as a weed, demonized in official publications, and systematically poisoned out of existence. Extension bulletins warn that yellow nutsedge becomes invasive without acknowledging what that word actually means. Invasive means successful, a plant that thrives without human help, that spreads naturally, that feeds wildlife and could feed humans. That's exactly what sustainable agriculture should look like. Instead, they've taught farmers to see abundance as a problem requiring chemical solutions. They've trained entire generations to pour poison on food that sustains civilizations. They've convinced everyone that a superfood is worthless, that a survival crop is a pest, that something offering free nutrition is an enemy. And who benefits from this narrative? Chemical companies selling herbicides, seed companies selling patented varieties, fertilizer manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, the entire industrial agriculture complex that generates billions by creating and maintaining dependency. They cannot make money from chufa, so chufa had to disappear from our collective memory. The knowledge that refuses to die. But knowledge doesn't die easily. It persists in unexpected places, carried by people who remember what corporations want us to forget. In Valencia, Spain, chufa cultivation continues as it has for 700 years. The Regulatory Council protects the heritage of horchata, defending traditional growing methods and processing techniques. It represents unbroken tradition, cultural memory that survived industrialization. In Africa, the Hausa people still cultivate chufa as a food crop, trading it in markets across Nigeria and Mali. The knowledge survived colonialism. It survived the Green Revolution that tried to replace traditional crops with industrial monocultures. It survived because people knew chufa kept them alive. In the last decade, chufa has begun appearing in health food stores marketed as tiger nuts. The paleo community discovered them. The gluten-free community discovered them. Athletes discovered them. People seeking alternatives to industrial food discovered them. Researchers are studying chufa for biodiesel because the oil content is so extraordinarily high, producing 174 gallons of oil per acre, rivaling commercial oil crops. Others are exploring chufa flour as a gluten-free alternative to wheat, finding it produces baked goods with exceptional texture and flavor. But notice what's not happening. No major agricultural university is promoting chufa as a staple crop for food security. No government agency is funding large-scale chufa research despite its obvious potential. They're still publishing bulletins on how to kill it. The infrastructure remains dedicated to suppression. The herbicide industry continues profiting from its destruction. The narrative remains unchanged. Chufa is a weed, not food, a pest, not a resource, a problem, not a solution. Why this matters now more than ever. But the plant survives, despite the herbicides, despite the propaganda, despite being classified as one of the worst weeds on earth. Chufa still grows wherever conditions allow. It still produces tubers. It still offers the same nutrition that sustained Egyptian civilization through thousands of years. And the knowledge survives. Every person who learns that the weed they've been poisoning is actually food from pharaohs' tombs becomes harder to control. Every farmer who discovers chufa produces more nutrition per acre than wheat represents lost profit for chemical companies. Every garden where chufa thrives without inputs is living proof that the industrial narrative is a lie. They classified it as a weed because they couldn't patent it. They created herbicides to kill it because they couldn't commodify it. They convinced everyone it's worthless because its value undermines their entire economic model. They want you dependent on their seeds, their chemicals, their system. But 16,000 years of human history tells a different story. A true story. a story written in tomb paintings and ancient texts, and the survival of civilizations that understood what we've been taught to forget. The story is simple. This plant feeds people abundantly and sustainably without asking permission from corporations. It produces nutrition without generating profit for chemical companies. It offers food security without creating dependency. And that is exactly why they want you to forget it exists. But you won't forget. Because now you know. The pharaohs knew. The agricultural departments definitely know. And now you know too. Chufa is still here, still growing in ditches and field margins and anywhere it can find purchase. Still offering 6,000 years of nutrition to anyone willing to remember. Still proving that the most vilified weeds might actually be the superfoods we need most. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? The hidden war against your food freedom. Let's go deeper into what this suppression actually means, because this isn't just about one plant. This is about a systematic war against food independence that's been waged for over a century. When you understand the Chufa story, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. Amaranth, once a staple grain of the Aztecs, so important they used it in religious ceremonies, was nearly eradicated by Spanish conquistadors who burned the fields and made cultivation punishable by death. Why? Because they couldn't control a population that could feed itself. Today, amaranth is dismissed as a pigweed in agricultural literature, another invasive species requiring chemical management. Purslane, which contains more omega-3 fatty acids than most fish oils, more vitamin E than spinach, and 7 times the beta-carotene of carrots, grows freely across North America. But walk into any garden center and you'll find herbicides specifically marketed to kill it. The plant your grandmother might have foraged for salads is now classified as a weed, its nutritional profile conveniently forgotten. The pattern repeats with lamb's quarters, stinging nettle, dandelion, plantain, all highly nutritious, all classified as weeds, all targeted for eradication. These aren't random decisions. This is systematic erasure of food knowledge that threatens corporate control. What you can actually do. But here's where this story transforms from tragedy to opportunity. The system's suppression of Chufa reveals its weakness. They can classify it as a weed, they can sell herbicides, they can omit it from nutritional guidelines and agricultural subsidies. But they cannot actually kill it. Not entirely, not everywhere. Chufa still grows wild across temperate and subtropical regions. The tubers are still viable. The knowledge still exists. And once you know what you're looking at, once you understand what that weed in the ditch actually represents, everything changes. You can source tiger nuts from health food suppliers and plant them. They grow easily in most climates with adequate moisture. One small planting can yield enough tubers to both eat and replant, creating a perpetual food source that costs nothing beyond your initial investment. You can make horchata. Simply soak the tubers overnight, blend with water, strain, and sweeten to taste. You've just created a nutritious milk alternative that costs pennies compared to store-bought options. You can dry and grind them into flour, incorporating it into baking at ratios that boost nutrition without changing familiar recipes dramatically. You can roast them as snacks, replacing processed foods with something that sustained human beings for 16,000 years. But more importantly, you can share this knowledge. Every person who learns what Chufa actually is, every gardener who chooses to cultivate rather than poison it, every family that adds it to their diet represents a small act of rebellion against a system that demands your dependence. The agricultural industry spent millions creating the narrative that Chufa is worthless. They succeeded in erasing it from mainstream consciousness for generations. But narratives can be rewritten. Memory can be restored. And a plant that survived 16,000 years isn't going to disappear because corporations find it unprofitable. The pharaohs knew what they were doing when they demanded Chufa for eternity. They chose the food that truly lasts, the nutrition that cannot be destroyed, the knowledge that refuses to die. Now that knowledge is yours. The question is, what will you do with it?